Well, good afternoon, church family. It is Monday, just a little bit after 12 o'clock, and it's time for your pastoral devotional. Now, unfortunately, Pastor Jared went off the rails a little bit in his sermon yesterday, thinking he could assign me my topic for today. And he mentioned that I would answer the question of, could Jesus have sinned? And that's a really complicated question. There are a number of different heavy and important theological things that are related to this. And while I don't want to encourage Pastor Jared to give me my subjects for pastoral devotionals, I also feel like it's a little too important not to address this. So I am going to, since it is my devotional, after all, I am going to tweak the question a little bit, and I'm going to try to answer the question which I thought Pastor Jared should be able to answer. Were Jesus' temptations that he experienced in Matthew chapter 4 real? And I'm going to make this very simple, and I think you should all be able to remember this. Yes. Yes, they were. Now, again, I would have expected Pastor Jared could answer that question, but for whatever reason, he didn't. So this question of were Jesus' temptations real is complicated, actually. And it's complicated because of the Bible, kind of. If we read in James chapter 1, verse 3, we read that God, I'm sorry, not verse 3, verse 13, we read that God cannot be tempted. And we know Jesus was God. So therefore, we can deduce, with a logical syllogism, Jesus is God, God cannot be tempted, therefore Jesus was not tempted. But we're missing something that's really important. And it's really the mystery of the incarnation. And so with the mystery of the incarnation, it's not just God, it's that the eternal second person of the Trinity, the Son of God, became flesh, became a person, was born of the Virgin Mary, conceived by the Holy Spirit, but was born and was a person just like we are people. And that's really, really important. In the early church, there were a number of false teachings, and I can't get into a lot of them. And if you have more questions on any of these things, you're always welcome to ask me. I would love to talk about this more. Actually, I have a paper I pulled out of my filing cabinet that's 20 plus pages that I wrote when I was working on my master's degree on this very subject. I don't have time for all of that. That would be a sermon or two in and of itself. But this question of the incarnation and the glorious mystery of it is that the eternal second person of the Trinity became like you and I in every way that we are, except without sin. And that comes from the book of Hebrews. And we need to go to the book of Hebrews to answer this question of were Jesus' temptations real? And while I was joking a little bit with saying just yes, obviously they were, it's really important when we talk about anything that we talk about those things the way the Bible talks about them. And we never want to be in a position where we are trying to explain away the things that the Bible teaches to make them easier for our minds to grasp. That's the danger zone. And we want to stay out of the danger zone. And we want to stay in the scriptures and make sure that the way we talk about who Jesus is and what he did is consistent with the scriptures. So I want to read a couple verses for you from the book of Hebrews in chapter 2. We're going to look at verses 14 to 18. This is what the author of Hebrews says. Since the children have flesh and blood, he, speaking of Jesus, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. For surely it is not angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants. For this reason, speaking of Jesus, he had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. Now listen to verse 18 very carefully, okay? Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. Jesus was tempted. His temptations were real. So what do we do about James? Well, again, this is complicated, but also kind of simple. Jesus is one person who had two complete natures. He had a complete divine nature and a complete human nature. And so we would say it like this: Jesus experienced real temptation in his human nature. Okay, that's a really important part of it. We can also say, it's right to say that on the cross, God suffered and died. So long as we mean on the cross, the Son of God suffered and died in his human nature. And this is not ever going to make complete sense to us, in the sense that our minds aren't going to go, whoa, how do we reconcile those things? But we have to make sure we talk about Jesus as one person, and that we talk about his two complete natures that he had, not in a way that they're mixed or confused or divided or muddled together, but there's two distinct natures. And we need to be really cautious that we don't, this is a common mistake, talk about the natures of Christ as if they're two separate people doing two separate things. So an example of this mistake would be to be like, when Jesus wept, his human nature is weeping, but when he does miracles, it's through his divine nature. No. We're making a mistake there, and we're talking about his natures as though they're two separate people. And then we almost have two separate Jesuses doing really confusing things. Jesus is one person with two complete natures. They're not confused, mixed, or divided. And the early church really had to flesh these out and make sure they talked about them in a way that was clear. So to answer the question, were Jesus' temptations real? Yes, they were real. Matthew 4 says that Jesus was tempted. He was led into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And Hebrews 2 tells us that he was tempted, and he needed to experience temptation, and he needed to be like us in every way that we are, except without sin, so that he could be the one that makes atonement or makes us right with God through what he did on the cross. Okay? I want to add just one other verse from Hebrews. It's going to be a couple verses, but from Hebrews chapter 4. I love these verses. These are a couple of my favorite in the Bible, and it's important to hold these clearly as well. Hebrews chapter 4, starting in verse 14, says, "Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For," verse 15, "we do not have a high priest who's unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need." I love these verses because they clearly affirm that Jesus is our great high priest who was tempted like we are. And whenever you're going through a hard time, when you're experiencing suffering, you should never be in a place where you're explaining away that Jesus really did suffer in his human nature, that he really was tempted in his human nature. And really, if we want to think about it even a little more clearly, Jesus experienced temptation like we do, but we give in, and he never did. He never alleviated that temptation. He never gave into it, but he bore in his own person the full weight of that in a way that we never can. So, church family, I want you to be encouraged that Jesus really understands our sufferings and our temptations. And boldly approach God's throne of grace in your time of need. Ask for help when you're fighting temptation by the power of the Spirit, and know and be comforted that you're never alone in the suffering or temptations that you're experiencing, but that Jesus can truly relate to those. Because Jesus, the one person who had two complete natures, did truly experience temptation and suffering in his human nature. So I hope that encourages you. If you're confused about it or you want to ask more questions, let me know. I'd love to sit down with you and talk about more of who Jesus is and what he's done. It's one of my favorite topics to talk about. And I guess I'll give Pastor Jared a little shout out and thanks for recommending this topic, even though I thought he would deal with it in his sermon. But anyway, you're loved. Be blessed today. Go in peace. Bye-bye.